It began with a kind of intoxicating, terrifying freedom. For the first 2 years of the war, the German U-boat commander was not merely a soldier. He was a pirate, a hunter, and a god in a steel tube. He was a member of the Kriegsmarine's elite, a Grey Wolf, led by Admiral Karl Donitz, a man who promised him absolute victory. The weapon was perfect. The target was vast. The war was personal. In 1940 and 1941, it was known as the Happy Time. The U-boats, mostly small, agile-type VIs, slipped beneath the waves of the North Atlantic and the torpedo junction off the American coastline. The targets were fat, slow, and countless. American cities refused to dim their lights. Ships sailed silhouetted against the bright glow of Miami, New York, and Boston. The German commanders sank them almost at will. Names like Gunther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Eric Topp became national heroes. They returned to the French ports of Lorient and St. Nazaire to roaring crowds, bouquets of flowers, and the Knight's Cross. They were young, mostly in their 20s, and they were undeniably the best in the world at what they did. This was a war of skill, of nerve, of cold, professional calculation. It was a duel between a handful of German submariners and the might of the British and American navies. And for a glorious, frightening period, the Germans were winning. Their mission was clear, brutal, and strategically vital. Choke the life out of Great Britain. Deny them the food, the steel, and the oil that flowed across the Atlantic. It was a race against time, a war of attrition where every sunken ship was a tick toward total victory. But this success, this legend of the Grey Wolves, was built on an illusion, the illusion of parity. In the autumn of 1941, the Americans finally joined the fight, and the game changed, not because the American ships were better, but because they were more. They were endless. A German commander, Lieutenant Commander Werner Lott, famous for his initial successes, began to see the cold reality in his patrol logs. He was sinking ships, but for every one he sank, the American shipyards launched 2 more. It was a relentless mathematical fact that began to override the glorious propaganda coming from Berlin. Lott wrote in his logbook, a sentiment that would later echo through the entire U-boat service. The Americans are like children playing in the dark. They are clumsy. Their commanders are unprofessional. Their radio traffic is amateurish. We can hear them coming and going, but there are simply too many children, and the one who builds the most ships will eventually win the war. This was the first realization. Their professional skill was meaningless against the tide of American industrial scale. The happy time was ending. The battle was shifting. It was no longer a personal duel. It was a factory war. The U-boat commanders were about to transition from being Hitler's greatest success story to becoming his last desperate fantasy. The shift began not with a change of orders, but with the arrival of a single silent enemy, technology. The first crack in the illusion was not industrial. It was technological. It arrived in the early spring of 1943, and the commanders called it Black May. The Battle of the Atlantic, that private, glorious hunting ground, turned overnight into a graveyard. The change was so sudden, so brutal, that it seemed less like warfare and more like dark magic. Submariners who had been aces 1 month were corpses the next. The Grey Wolves had always relied on their stealth, their ability to disappear beneath the waves. Now they could not disappear. They were being hunted by an invisible force. The Allied destroyers, once clumsy and easily evaded, now descended upon them with terrifying precision. New weapons, the Hedgehog mortar, which fired multiple charges ahead of the destroyer, eliminating the need to pass over the target, were shattering their hulls. But the real terror was the sky. New, long-range Allied aircraft, flying over the previously safe mid-Atlantic gap, were suddenly finding U-boats on the surface, even in the dead of night, even in thick fog. The commanders, standing watch in the cold Atlantic air, would hear a sudden, high-pitched alarm, see the flares ignite the darkness, and feel the cold rush of the guns firing, followed instantly by depth charges. It took the German command months to realize the truth. The Allies had perfected centimetric radar. It was technology that could spot a U-boat on the surface in rough seas, even in heavy weather. Their boats were being seen, but they had no idea how. This was a psychological disaster. The U-boat commander, the elite professional, was now being beaten by a machine. His skill, his seamanship, his nerve, all useless against an unseen electronic eye. Captain Wilhelm Schulz, an experienced commander, wrote in his diary in May 1943, just days before his last patrol, "We are being tracked like animals. We surface for air and they are there. They see us through the storm. The Englishman knows where we are before we know where he is. This is not war, it is target practice. The spirit of the men is breaking, not by battle, but by this terrifying, inhuman helplessness." In May 1943, 43 U-boats were sunk. 43, a third of the operational fleet. This was a catastrophic, unsustainable loss rate. It was the moment Dönitz, now promoted to Grand Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the entire Navy, knew the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. He was forced to pull the U-boats out of the primary convoy routes. The Gray Wolves retreated. It was a strategic vacuum, this collapse of the Navy's most successful arm, that created conditions for the U-boat service to receive its final, impossible destiny. The defeat in the Atlantic was about to become the last, desperate hope of the entire Reich. The defeat in the Atlantic in the spring of 1943 was not an isolated incident. It was one piece of a collapsing strategic jigsaw. By that summer, the German military machine had begun to disintegrate on every front. In the east, the armies were stalled and bleeding at Kursk. In the south, Italy had fallen out of the war, and the Mediterranean was lost. The once dominant Luftwaffe was losing the air war decisively over Germany itself. The heavy surface fleet, once the great pride of the Kriegsmarine, was crippled or confined to port, rendered obsolete by British air power and the constant threat of torpedoes. The great battleships were an embarrassment, their guns silent. Hitler needed a miracle, and he needed a weapon that could still reach the enemy's heart. With the tanks stalled and the air force bleeding, the only viable offensive weapon left in the entire Reich was a U-boat, the small, silent, persistent threat, the only weapon that could still strike at Britain and America. The immense, impossible weight of the entire war now settled upon the shoulders of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat service. He was no longer just the head of the submarine arm. He was now the commander-in-chief of the entire German Navy. His success was their last hope. His failure would mean total strategic paralysis. And Dönitz, a loyal fanatic, transferred that crushing burden directly onto his commanders. The psychological warfare shifted. The U-boats were no longer fighting a war of tonnage, trying to star Britain. They were fighting a war of propaganda. Their mission was not to win the Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz knew that was lost, but to convince the Allied command, and more importantly, Hitler, that the battle could still be won. The messages received by the commanders in their cold steel tubes went from tactical commands to fanatical pronouncements. The orders were no longer about where to find convoys, but how to exemplify the unbroken spirit of the German fighting man. A staff briefing memo sent out in late 1943 captured the delusion. The U-boat arm is the only force capable of delivering decisive blows against the Anglo-Saxon powers. The successes of our brave captains are the only means by which the morale of the German nation can be sustained. You are no longer merely fighting for the sea lanes. You are fighting for the Führer and the future of the Reich. The commanders who read these words, men who were dodging radar, surviving days of relentless depth charging, and mourning the disappearance of their friends, understood the terrible truth. They had become a symbol, and the delusional high command was willing to spend every man and every boat to maintain that symbol. They were no longer professionals engaged in a war of attrition. They had become, in the final, desperate vision of a collapsing regime, Hitler's last hope, and the commanders knew that the hope was a lie. The strategic shift was crushing. The daily reality was worse. The commanders, once the pride of the nation, became isolated, claustrophobic wardens of a doomed mission. Consider the reality of a patrol in 1944. The boats were still the old-type VIIs, but now equipped with the snorkel, a breathing tube that allowed the boat to run its diesel engines just below the surface. This innovation was meant to save them. Instead, it delivered them to a living hell. The U-boat was now forced to stay submerged for weeks, even months at a time. The men lived in a damp, stinking steel tomb. There was no fresh air, Only the stale, oil-tinged atmosphere recycled through the snorkel. The sheer, physical degradation was immense. The psychological toll was greater still. They were blind, deaf, and slow, their only asset being the darkness of the deep. The pride of the hunter was replaced by the terror of the hunted. Every metallic ping, every distant engine noise, every shift in the water pressure was a reminder that the Allies knew where they were and were closing in. Corvette Captain Eric Peterson, an ace of the early war who was now commanding his 10th Patrol, recorded his despair in a private journal, smuggled out only after the war's end. We sit here, 60 meters down, listening to the incessant hammering of the engines above. The morale of the boys is gone. They were promised victory. They were promised a quick, clean fight. Now they simply endure. The food is rotten. The air is foul. And the orders from Berlin grow more fantastic with every passing day. They tell us we are winning the war. They tell us the tide has turned. But we know the truth. The surface is death. The enemy knows everything. We are not hunters. We are ballast, delaying the inevitable. This realization that the high command was feeding them deliberate lies was the ultimate psychological break. They could accept dying for the Führer. They could not accept dying for a propaganda myth. The commanders, once masters of their craft, now found themselves leading crews composed of inexperienced boys and older men drafted from the merchant navy. The technical skill that defined the early U-Bootwaffe was gone. Their only mission was to take these young lives, often on their first voyage, directly into the jaws of the waiting Allied hunter-killer groups. The crushing responsibility for these doomed crews fell entirely on the captain. He alone carried the weight of the war's delusion. He alone knew that the fervent, fanatic messages from Donitz, demanding greater sacrifice, greater audacity, were no longer orders for victory, but orders for collective suicide. The commanders of the late war were fighting two battles, one against the Allied convoy system, and one against a pervasive, destructive delusion emanating from Berlin. This delusion was embodied in the desperate promise of the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons. Donitz, clinging to the hope of technological salvation, assured his captains that the revolutionary Type XXI Electro Boot was coming. It was a true submarine, faster and more silent underwater than any Allied vessel. It was the future. But the commanders in the Atlantic knew the terrible gap between propaganda and reality. The Type XXI, plagued by production delays and Allied bombing, was still months, even years, away from deployment in meaningful numbers. They were told to hold the line, to sacrifice themselves, using obsolete Type 7 boats, just to buy time for a weapon that might never arrive. The messages from the high command reflected this descent into fanaticism and denial. Donitz's radio transmissions, which had once been cold and strategic, became increasingly ideological and desperate. They ceased to be orders. They became calls for martyrdom. A radio message from Donitz to the fleet in late 1944 captured the profound psychological burden. Every man must believe with fanatical devotion that final victory is possible. The sacrifice of life must not be avoided. The fate of the German nation is now entirely in your hands. You, the men of the U-boat service, must be the unyielding example of National Socialist willpower. The commanders, sitting in their claustrophobic, fuel-starved steel coffins, heard this transformation. They heard the shift from Kriegsmarine professionalism to fanatical political dogma. They realized they were no longer valued as elite sailors. They were valued as martyrs in waiting. Their mission had been stripped of strategic purpose and reduced to an ideological gesture. They were being sacrificed not to sink ships, but to sustain the Führer's crumbling political facade for a few more weeks. The pressure created a crisis of conscience. Should they waste their young, demoralized crews on missions they knew were impossible, thus fueling the delusion? Or should they attempt to survive, to preserve their crew in defiance of an increasingly fanatical chain of command? The professional code demanded loyalty. The human code demanded survival. It was a choice between suicide for a lie or insubordination for the truth. This was the crushing way to becoming Hitler's last hope. The terrible realization that their loyalty was being used not for victory, but for their own certain, pointless annihilation. The final months of the war in 1945 became a descent into military absurdity. The U-boat commanders were receiving orders so disconnected from reality that they were indistinguishable from suicide pacts. The missions were no longer about breaking the Atlantic blockade. They were often frantic, secretive, and impossible. U-boats were dispatched on desperate cargo runs, ferrying high-ranking officials, fleeing scientists, or perhaps even gold and sensitive documents. The operational purpose had completely dissolved into the political survival of the few. Commanders were being sent to sea in half-finished Type XXI boats, or in ancient Type I staffed by skeleton crews of inexperienced boys, many of whom were seeing the ocean for the first time. The official radio messages continued their frantic, delusional pitch. Victory is near. The Western Allies are weak. The U-boat is the sword of the Reich. But the captains, isolated beneath the waves, knew the truth. They knew the propaganda was a weapon aimed not at the enemy, but at them. They were being told to die for a lie to maintain the illusion of control in the collapsing bunkers of Berlin. The final betrayal came from their own side. As the Allied armies closed in, the commanders realized that the supply chain had vanished. They sailed into battle knowing they had barely enough fuel for the mission, and often not enough to return. Their torpedoes were faulty. Their air support, a promise repeated endlessly in radio traffic, was a fantasy. They were disposable. This final psychological fracture was a collapse of professional loyalty. The commander's ultimate loyalty was supposed to be to the Führer. But the commander who had a look in the eyes of his 50 terrified young sailors, knowing that the sword of the Reich was a fuel-starved metal coffin, made a silent, profound choice. His loyalty shifted from fanatical ideal to fragile, human lives sealed inside his hull. The diary of one commander, whose name is lost to history, captured this final ethical shift. The orders demand we fight to the last shell, to the last breath. The Führer demands the ultimate sacrifice. But my heart demands that I save these boys. For what purpose is their death? The war is lost. They are being murdered for a political sentence. I will maintain the lie until the last possible moment. But when the time comes, I will choose my crew over the Führer. This quiet, desperate mutiny, the choice of humanity over fanaticism, was a commander's final act of courage. They sailed, they fought, and they delayed the inevitable, but their purpose was no longer the Reich. Then, on April 30th, 1945, Hitler died. The authority of the Kriegsmarine was immediately transferred to Grand Admiral Dönitz, who was named Hitler's successor. The architect of the U-boat campaign was now the final, acting Führer of the German Reich. And the commanders of the U-boats waited for the final, dreaded order from a man who had promised them victory, only to make them the last, futile hope. On May 4th, 1945, the order came. The final word, the one the U-boat commanders had waited for, came not from the fanatical Führer, but from his successor, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign. The man who had ordered them to fight until the last shell was now the one who ordered them to stop. The message, crackling across the radio and received in the claustrophobic depths of the North Atlantic, was simple. Cease hostilities. Proceed immediately to the nearest Allied port for surrender. The commanders who read the order felt a profound, complex, and agonizing shift. For the fanatical few, it was a profound act of betrayal by their beloved admiral. For the vast majority, it was the moment the crushing psychological weight was finally lifted, replaced by a deep, agonizing, and final professional shame. The ultimate betrayal was a command to surrender. These men, indoctrinated in a service that held surrender as the highest form of cowardice, were now ordered to commit the one act they had sworn to avoid. What did German U-boat commanders say when they realized they had become Hitler's last hope? They said nothing. They received the surrender order in silence. They executed the order with the cold, professional obedience that had always defined them. They surfaced their boats, many of them listing and scarred, often in the presence of the Allied destroyers they had spent years hunting. They raised the black flag, the symbol of surrender, to the very enemy they had been promised they would sink. They said nothing as they watched their young crews, the boys they had sworn to protect, blink against the sunlight, finally breathing fresh air, but defeated. They said nothing as they were taken off their boats, the steel tubes that had been their claustrophobic world for years. The war had been lost, not in a climatic seed battle, but in the slow, agonizing, inevitable reality of American industrial capacity. The U-boat commanders have been betrayed by technology, by their own delusional chain of command, and by the strategic arrogance that convinced Hitler their professional skill could win a war of numbers. The price of becoming Hitler's last hope was the total annihilation of their service and the bitter, final realization that they had been sacrificed for a political lie. Their final words were simply silence. The silence of the radio, the silence of the engines, the silence on the bridge as the Allied boarding party arrived. That silence spoke volumes. It was a complete, total collapse of a powerful delusion. The war was over. The lie was exposed. The professional had lost the fight against the factory.